So I am a firm believer that everything happens for a reason. So this entire presentation is essentially the story of how I became a designer, how I started Vocal Type Co., and what's next. My journey began at the age of 4. It started with a headache, and it went to a lot of eye blinking and even more headaches that were just paralyzing. I had a brain tumor. Through that ordeal, drawing and cursive and writing were my only means of really working through that pain. And I would practice writing in cursive so much until my handwriting looked like the sample sheets. And it just, even after the tumor was gone, I needed a way to really express what I was feeling. And drawing and writing were still my only means of doing that. Once, before the tumor, I was drawing pictures of skateboarders and basketball players. And once it was gone, something changed in me. I was no longer drawing those pictures. I was drawing pictures of Venus de Milo and pictures of lost memories and Greek columns. And a lot was going on during this time. Not only had I gone through this ordeal once, but I was diagnosed with a second brain tumor. And I just continued drawing. And that was the only thing that really got me through this ordeal. 2002 to later, I also became more observant. I just started looking at the world differently. I experienced racism for the first time. I started getting interested in Black history, which just made racism way more confusing to me. I started paying attention to my parents more. I was watching them run their own business, and that inspired me to start my own business. So in the 5th grade, while I was supposed to be running the school store selling pencils and erasers and poppers to kids, I was convincing them to have me draw, graffiti their name on an index card and sell it for $3 a piece. And that drive just kind of stayed in me. If there was something I wanted to make, I was going to try to make it. If I could sell it, I was going to sell it. So from that point on, all the way through college, I was designing and selling bead jewelry and T-shirts and resumes and Lego jewelry and books and whatever my mind could conjure up. 2011 to 2013, I was still doing my hustle, but there was something else that I was working on. I was working on my first real personal project, long-term personal project. And it started out as just a few sketches, but as time progressed, I realized that I really wanted to make my own typeface. And I didn't know anything about making a typeface back then, but I was determined that one day I would learn how. So from 2011 to 2012, all I did was sketch all day, every day, trying to build this typeface. Until 2013, my sophomore year of college, I finally unveiled Unveil. Unveil was, my original sketches were based on a typeface called Futura, but I still didn't really know anything about type design back then, but I knew a lot about illustration. So I used Futura as the base and applied my illustration skills to this font family, where you can build 5 different layers. And you can layer all of them into something like this and making a lot of different various compositions. And over time, up until about 2015, I would keep adding new features to these typefaces, like the custom star dingbats that you can see at the bottom right. And thinking about the time when I was designing tattoos for people. And as time went on, I was just amazed at the response that I got from crafting this font family. Next thing I knew, it had been downloaded 30,000 times. And I stopped checking because I just kept kicking myself for not charging at least 50 cents. But after the hype died down, branding really became my passion. From 2014 to 2017, if I could find someone who needed a logo or a stationery set, I was going to do it. I even rebranded the studio I worked for back in 2014. And as time progressed, branding really became my specialty. So, and that's even today, that's still what I really get hired for. By the time I graduated in 2015, I accepted a job offer at a staffing agency known as the Creative Group, where I had the opportunity to work for 8 or 9 different companies, from agency to studio, in-house, out-house, everything in between. And it really taught me a lot about what kind of designer I want to be, and more importantly, what kind of clients I want to work with. I didn't want to spend my days working on a social media campaign saying how coal is clean fuel, or just crazy, nonsensical things like that. And I just realized that I really loved branding real estate agencies and properties, and that really became my thing. But then one day in June of 2016, I was working on another identity for a real estate agency, and I got really, really bored. I was searching for inspiration. I went through my library. I was going through Pinterest, Instagram, Behance, Dribble, you name it, I went through it. And I just wasn't inspired anymore. Everything looked the same to me. Where I was supposed to see character and culture, I was just seeing monotony and stereotypes. And don't get me wrong, I understand that stereotypes are more of a societal problem, but follow me here. Not long after I started feeling this way, I discovered an article by Dr. Cheryl D. Holmes Miller, which she wrote back in 1986 as her college thesis, called Black Designers Missing in Action. This article is what really got me thinking, and she started explaining how when an industry is dominated by a single race or perspective, in more cases white men, then it's harder for people to actually be able to, designers to actually be able to market to global communities. And I go to one step, so for example, let's say if you want to market to a black and brown communities, then you would need black and brown creatives to have a seat at the table. And I'll take our thesis one step further and say that if you would like to market to female creatives, to female communities, then you need to have female creatives have a seat at the table. Even today, female creatives, even though they outnumber men in the design industry, they don't have the leadership positions that they need to make an actual difference. And I'll take her thesis one step further and say that if you want to market to LGBTQ communities, or more religious communities, or different ethnic communities, indigenous communities, then they all need to have a seat at the table. And it wasn't long after that when I really decided that I wanted to do something about that. And during July of 2016, she published a sequel to her original college thesis called Black Designers Still Missing in Action. And it wasn't talking about as much as the issue of diversity in design, but more of a way of passing the torch to black designers and telling them to take their place in the industry. And that really got me thinking about what can I do to diversify design. And the more I thought about it, I started thinking about my days of writing in cursive, of graffitiing people's names on index cards and creating Unveil, and I decided to make my own font foundry. The end result, Vocal Type Co., a font foundry that creates typefaces based on the history of minority cultures and different perspectives. The first typeface I ever really created was Martin. Martin is what I call a nonviolent typeface, inspired by the Memphis sanitation strike of 1968. During that time, Memphis sanitation workers were protesting for better wages, safer working conditions after a malfunctioning garbage truck killed 2 trash handlers. And the end result was this typeface, which I also found the lowercase characters were used for certain newspapers during the time. After a while, Martin Luther King actually joined the cause and joined the Memphis sanitation workers to protest this injustice. However, unfortunately, it was the last cause that he ever got a chance to fight for, as he was killed that April. A few days after his death, his wife, Coretta Scott King, had a series of signs made that no longer just simply read, "I am a man" and "Union Justice Now," but now also "Honor King" and "Racism." Continuing Dr. King's legacy is BAYARD. BAYARD is what I call a case-sensitive typeface, inspired by the hand-painted signs that once hung outside of the national headquarters for the March on Washington. Bayard Rustin was actually Dr. King's mentor. And you may not know his name, but he was the one who organized the 1963 March on Washington, at which Dr. King gave his momentous I Have a Dream speech. So without him, God knows how long it would have taken for the civil rights movement to actually get its momentum and succeed. When it comes to a typeface like this, where certain characters may have different quirks, may have more unusable quirks than others, I usually create a cleaned up version for designers to use, and then what I call a historical alternate, which is kind of in the background for them to swap out as they please in case they don't want to use characters that are a little bit more quirky like that S in Washington. And we keep the clean versions in the forefront like these. After that, I created a stencil typeface called James, named after civil rights activist James Farmer, who founded in 1942 founded an organization called CORE. CORE was an acronym for the Congress of Racial Equality, and from 1942 all the way through the late 70s, James Farmer was in charge of organizing some protests, most notably this one that took place in St. Louis in 1963. But the reason that this protest did not have as much traction as the March on Washington was simply because the March on Washington got more press. But this was actually the longest running civil rights protest in St. Louis history, lasting a total of 7 months. The result of this was a custom typeface inspired by the signs carried at this march. And sometimes I take a few liberties. This was actually the first time I took any liberties, and used references from other movements. So the outline version of this typeface was actually inspired by signs carried during the Black Lives Matter protests. After this typeface this font family was finished, I started thinking about creating fonts based on cultures other than my own. So the first thing that came to mind was Eva. For those of you probably know her better as Evita. Eva was originally an actress, and at the age of 26 became the first lady of Argentina. She was one of the most prominent advocates for women's suffrage throughout Argentina. And I created a custom typeface inspired by banners held during a parade at the National Congress for national suffrage. Each one of these typefaces within the family uses one of her names. So the previous one was Eva Duarte, while this one is Eva Perón, and my favorite is Eva Maria. Now, I don't know what to call it. The name is still a working title, but it has something where each set has a different set of serifs. So one set, the top set are back slanted, the ones in the middle are vertical, and then the ones at the bottom are slanted. Last but not least, RUBEN. RUBEN was named after activist and journalist Ruben Salazar. Based in Los Angeles, RUBEN was an advocate for Latino rights. And during the 1974 National Chicano Moratorium, Ruben Salazar was killed while protesters were fighting to have Latino troops drawn out of Vietnam for their overpopulation. What I find most interesting about this typeface is that it's similar to Bayard, even though the construction is very different. The top portion, the uppercase characters, have more contrast, while the middle ones are almost monolinear. And my favorite part is definitely how drastically different the numerals are. But beyond, now that you've seen all of the typefaces that are currently available through VocalType, I also do custom work, which is probably my favorite part because I'm able to take a few more liberties than I normally would. The first and largest custom project I've ever done through Vocal is Broom. Broom is a typeface inspired by the very first African-American-owned record label in America. It was designed for Umber magazine, which is an Oakland-based magazine for creatives of color, just a platform for them to tell their stories. But I thought a regular old sans serif just wasn't enough. It's been done before. And because this was the sound issue, I turned that one custom typeface into a font family inspired by sound waves. And that way, what you see here is basically a visual representation of all the weights layered on top of each other. But I wanted to do this so that the designers at Umber magazine would be able to make more dynamic compositions like this. Or this if they wanted to highlight certain terms. And at the moment, I have quite a bit going on. I have about four typefaces in the works, the first of which is William. William is named after philanthropist, sociologist, author, civil rights activist, W.B. Du Bois. Not only is he all that, but W.B. Du Bois was actually the first African American to receive their doctorate from Harvard, no less. And after receiving his doctorate, he went on to become a professor at Atlanta University, where he was asked to make a contribution to the Paris World's Fair. And what did he come up with? He came up with nearly 60 infographics, poster-sized infographics explaining how even though slavery was over, disparities were still prevalent among the African American communities. But what is most interesting to me about these infographics is that they were created nearly 20 years before Bauhaus, which kind of redefines design history for me. The typeface at its current stage comes in 3 weights. I did take some liberties with this one because there were no lowercase characters in the original specimen. And my favorite part is definitely the use of back and regular italics, which you really don't see during that period. Each weight has on average 3 to 5 stylistic alternates per character, which allows for severely different, and you can see it most clearly in these paragraphs where the ones on the left are the regular and they have quite a bit of detail, but the ones on the right are very minimal in ad legibility. Next is CARRIE, named after Carrie Chapman Catt. She is the successor of Susan B. Anthony, a suffragette. And she was the organizer of the 1915 Women's March in New York, which during that time was the greatest march that the women's suffrage movement had ever seen in America. What I think is most interesting about this font family is the symbolism behind some of the characters. For example, the L's have flames almost as if inspired by the flame of the Statue of Liberty. And the N's feel like they're actually marching along with the women. Last but not least is Untitled. It has no name, it has no real story, but I think it's a true testament to how we're all more similar than we like to think. These images are from the women's suffrage movement throughout the 19-teens and 20s. These are from the anti-Vietnam protests in the 60s. And these are from the civil rights movement throughout the 60s. What I think is so interesting about these characters beyond just being typographic is that their typographic similarities is that they are all in different locations. Some are in the streets of New York and LA and DC, and others are in the suburbs of Chicago and Memphis. And you can really see their similarities here, which, like I said, is just a testament to how similar we really are. Last but not least, as far as diversity in design goes, I just want to leave you with one piece of advice. Diversity is systemic, and it's going to take many generations for us to actually solve this issue, for us to see sustainable gains through this issue. But right now, all of us can help with inclusion. All you really need to do is understand. Go out and listen. Understand and listen. Listen to people who are the complete opposite of you, who don't look like you, who don't love like you, who don't celebrate like you, who aren't from where you're from, because understanding is the key to inclusion. Thanks for understanding. I hope you understand. Thank you.